Keep that in mind as we go through. So anyway, these guys are jealous of him, his fellow politicians. There was going to be three guys. Daniel was one. He was going to make, underneath the king, there was three guys called administrators, presidents, whatever. There was three of them, and the king was going to make Daniel over all of them. And these guys said, no, we can't handle this. Here's this guy. He's not even Persian. He's not even Babylonian. He's a Jew from Israel. And they can't find anything unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they've got to dig something up. They've got to create something. How many of you in high school had a person, and I can remember this, maybe I'll just tell the story and then we'll ask you the question later. When I was in high school, we had a brother and sister that were in our class one year, and I still remember the day vividly. We're coming to the end of the day, probably the end of the week, and the brother and sister raised their hand. It seems to me in my mind, it's probably not the way it happened, but this is the way I remember it. They raised their hand, and at the same time, they both say, "Teacher, you forgot to give us our homework." I'm not kidding. In my mind, that's how it happened. Now, that may be completely irrelevant, but I know that something like that happened that day. You've all been in classes where there was somebody like that, right? And you know how you felt about them. That's how these people feel about Daniel. Now, here's the catch. If you cannot remember anybody in your class like that, it's because it's you. And you were the one that did that. And the rest of the people were looking at you going, would you just be quiet for a second? But Daniel is the guy that ruins the curve. Daniel is the guy that normal people are upset with because God has so blessed him and he's so favored and he's so squeaky clean that we can't find anything on him. And I don't think Daniel was as annoying as the kids in my class. Teacher, you didn't give us our homework. But even if he was completely humble, that had to get on your nerves after a while. We want to stop his promotion, but we've got absolutely nothing on him. You realize how unlikely that is, that in 50 years? And some versions add at the end of verse 3 that an excellent spirit was in him. And we saw earlier on that Nebuchadnezzar said the spirit of Almighty God is in you. And it was implied in chapter 1 and in chapter 4, 5, and 6. It's stated that way. The spirit of God was on him. And they couldn't find anything to get him in trouble with the king. And as I was reading about Daniel and thinking this through, it reminded me of the verse in 1 Peter that says, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And that's in 1 Peter 2:12 if you wanted to write it down. But to me, Daniel is the epitome of that verse. Though they're trying to find something wrong, they can't find anything. And the verse ends, and they glorify God on the day he visits us. So for Daniel to truly define this verse, that's what has to happen in this story. So with all these other administrators and all these other guys trying to get Daniel, they have to come up with something. Now you're all familiar, hopefully by this point, with the story of Daniel in the lion's den, right? I need to hear right there. Please don't make me go back and tell the whole story. You know what happens. I hope so. Let's go way back to start in Genesis. What I did not recognize in this story, and you may not have either, is that this was never intended to be a permanent law. This thing that they came up with. Look there in verse 6. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "Oh, King Darius, live forever." What a great way, just butter him up. The royal administrators, the prefects, the satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. I don't think Daniel was in the loop on this one, so we got a little bit of a fib here. We have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. I always thought this was a law that was supposed to be forever and ever and ever. When they only make it for 30 days, it kind of shows up what they're trying to do, doesn't it? Because they couldn't even follow this law. It's pretty well known that among this time, especially in the Persian Empire, that they were very open and accepting of other gods. And if you had a god like Daniel did that was doing powerful things, we would add him to our list of gods. It's not just he is the one and only. We've seen he can do some things. We'll add him to the list and worship him too. So what you need to see, secondly this morning, is that Daniel's pattern of prayer led to his persecution. How did they know about this? And we've probably you still see the flannel graph in your mind, don't you? When you're in Sunday school, you see the little flannel graph of Daniel's, maybe even that on your flannel graph, the window's open and there's Daniel inside praying, right up on his rooftop. Let me encourage you to look past your flannel graph in Sunday school and go back and actually read it sometime. Because sometimes those flannel graph guys took some liberties with interpretations, just so you know. In this case, it's not that big a deal. But all Daniel has to do is just keep those shutters closed for 30 days, right? And they can't know what he's doing. It's just 30 days. It'll be fine. But it says in verse 10 that he did just as he had done before. They have to know that he goes to his upper room and prays. Now, it was common in Daniel's time for them to do prayers at 9, noon, and at 3, which is what we see in the book of Acts, and we've talked about that. When Peter and John were going up to the temple, it was the 9th hour of the day, which is 3 o'clock. A man of nearly 80 years old now, and he offends men because he prays too much. Because he prays to God. Oh, that I could offend some people because of my prayer life. I would love that to be true. Pastor, you pray too. You said that to me this week in a different context. You pray too much, Pastor. You're spending too much time in prayer. Okay. Thank you for that criticism. I'll take that. It doesn't tell us that Daniel prayed while he was in the lion's den. The text doesn't tell us that. We assume that he did. All I know is that if he hadn't prayed before the lion's den, then he certainly was praying in the lion's den. But the only reason we know that Daniel survived is because he was praying before the lion's den. You have to pray before the evil comes, before the bad things happen to you. And often in this country we have a habit of when bad things happen, then we turn to prayer, don't we? We're going to talk about that in a few weeks on September 11th. You realize it's been 10 years since September 11th. I want to talk a little bit about that theme. We're going to develop that theme of prayer in a few weeks. Now Daniel, he's in this den of lions because his prayers are predictable. They knew how to trap him, which is okay. At least from the time of day they took place, they knew where to look. And we don't have any of Daniel's prayers recorded, so we can't really speak about what he prayed exactly. And one of the things that I want, this is kind of this may seem that it doesn't really fit with what I'm trying to say, but Daniel's pattern of prayer led to his persecution. One of the things that I want us to do in our 30 days of prayer is I want you to break some of your patterns, some of your habits. There's an old saying that if you're going to do what you've always done, you're always going to get what you've always got. And if your prayer life is a little stale, if you keep doing the way you've always prayed, you're always going to get what you've always got. So I want you, and I'm not saying anything radical or revolutionary, I just want you to think outside the box and think about prayer in a different way. It's just communion with God is really what it is. And I think Daniel knew that. Now, even though there was a pattern to it, and that's how he got in trouble, I want us to think beyond patterns. And maybe it keeps you disciplined, and I'm fine with that. But this is just one of the things that I want us to move. The last thing you need to see this morning is that Daniel's confidence in prayer led to God's presence. In Matthew and in Mark, Jesus said, "If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer." So whether or not Daniel was praying in the lion's den, we don't know. But the king shows up. Remember, it says he has a sleepless night. He doesn't even have any entertainment that night, which is an interesting little phrase in there. He doesn't have anybody he may have even skipped a meal. His heart is broken about Daniel, this guy he was going to promote, and now he's had to throw him in the den of lions. So the king has a sleepless night. He runs there the next morning. Sure enough, Daniel's alive, and he rejoices, and we're going to see his response here in a minute. Now, there is really no danger at all that in our 30 days of prayer that you're going to be thrown into a lion's den because of it. There's no danger. You don't have to worry about that. I am 99% confident that if you entered into this 30 days of prayer with us, you will not be thrown into a den of lions. Maybe even more than that. And most of you would probably agree with that. But Daniel was 99% sure that if he did, he would. And he did it anyway. And all he had to do was take 30 days off. In fact, you will not only not be thrown into a den of lions, probably nothing will happen to you physically. Your neighbor's not going to watch you and say, "Why do you pray so much?" May not happen. Spiritually, however, I believe you'll be changed. I believe that your prayer life will be changed and shaped in such a way that it'll never be the same. And that's what I pray for, that God transforms our prayer lives in such a way that we never want to go back to the old way.